Today I'm talking about the idea of there being 5 survival group types that occur after a breakdown of civil order. So now, to a certain extent, well, actually, not to a certain extent, it's totally a response to another video. I was going to credit the other person who did the video, but it's all AI. So essentially, it's AI generated video with kind of the cartoon style drawings, and then the voice is clearly AI as well. And I very much doubt an AI channel would give me credit for a video I'm doing, so I'm not going to give them credit either. I'm just going to talk about it because I saw some really hideous stuff that just didn't make any sense in terms of how they were describing how things worked. So essentially their take was that there are 5 different types of survivalist groups that always pop up after a disaster when civil government is gone. The first one they said is military, where essentially some kind of military organization or kind of like military wannabes form up and basically function in a military style system. They said this always looks really cool because they seem like they got their stuff together. And then there's essentially what he calls the community neighborhood watch type group. Essentially, his view is that they're a communal group that sets things up in such a way that they kind of do the whole centralizing resources and sharing and stuff like that. And then he talks about essentially your marauder biker gangs, and then like extended family groups like clans, and then ultimately what he just talks about as distributed nodes. And in the mindset of this person, all these groups fail in under a year except for the distributed nodes. And I see a lot of issues with what they came up with. Now, the 5 groups themselves aren't too far off reality, such as reality is, because obviously there's a lot of problems with basically saying that this is what always happens. Now we do have a few examples of states collapsing, but they also collapse at the same time that there are other nations around to provide some level of support. So, like, a prime example always gets to be Somalia. What happens to Somalia when uh, its central government collapses? Well, it does kind of break down into these 5 groups. But the thing is Somalia would be incapable of running like it is unless the world around it, if the world around it wasn't giving it some level of supplies, they would be non-functional. Now, nature of events is going to dramatically impact uh, how these groups actually function. I mean, if you're talking in like the aftermath of an asteroid collision, something that's or massive volcanism, where you essentially have a worldwide calamity akin to what happens in the road. Well, yeah, then all groups are going to collapse, and no one's going to work. Not even the distributed nodes that he believes are the ultimate solutions to it. Um, so what I'm going to do is look at this in terms of what happens if essentially all the nation states of the world collapse at the same time, or rather, fairly quickly. Uh, probably assumes that at least 10% of the population has died. Around 10% is when the division of labor starts collapsing. You basically have to come up with a new division of labor by uh, determining what was being done before that isn't as important anymore. That needs to be done in a different way because you also lose some automation when you do that. You can regain it, but it takes a little bit of work. Okay, threat dynamics also have a big impact on how these groups function. That's why I'm talking about why, like, zombie apocalypse would make things altogether different. So we're not talking, although playing over Zomboid, we're not going to actually talk about a zombie apocalypse because that dramatically changes the dynamics of how people react and what they have to do. Uh, if your threat matrix includes the survival of another nation, that dramatically changes how people cooperate. If everybody's kind of in the same boat, uh, then you have something where you can actually look at how the groups are going to run. I'm going to look at this entirely as only the US culture because, well, obviously I'm the most familiar with that. I can't tell you how other countries would react. And also, like places like Europe, where the population densities are completely different, are going to have a really big impact on how things work as well. Yikes! Where did you guys all come from? Right out of the fog. Okay. I don't think the fog is that bad to justify what they just did. Oh, okay. So essentially, what happens when you have some kind of breakdown? You're going to kind of go through a bunch of different phases. You're going to have kind of like this immediate thought of survival idea, but at the same time, you're going to be thinking, "Oh, someone's going to come get us. Someone's going to rescue us. This, we're not all on our own here." Eventually, that'll turn into like the gathering and looting phase, where you're not going to be like you're going to be trying to take things that don't belong to anybody anymore. And what ends up happening then is you're going to end up going into kind of the grouping and fortifying phase. Human beings naturally group. They're going to try to find out the problem. So More cop. And then you're going to end up probably going into what I would call the factions and conflict phase, where you're going to have your group and you're going to start running into other groups, and you're going to figure out how are you going to deal with these other groups. You know, are you going to be friendly? Are you going to trade? Are you going to be keeping each other at a distance? All kinds of different impacts there. And then you're going to eventually get into kind of unresolved conflicts where certain things are just going to have to stand the way they are, because you aren't going to be able to project your group. You're going to be limited by how far you can project your group. And then eventually it's going to go into some kind of interim order phase where everybody's okay. The interim order phase essentially happens when the group is pretty much kind of hit their paces. They can't really expand anymore based on their capabilities or the size of their group, and the groups are spread out enough to where they're not in direct conflict with each other. Doesn't mean conflict ends, it just means that it's not the primary thing that's going on at them. So in this video, they talked about the military, and he kind of portrayed it. They mixed the concept of actual military organizations and wannabes, kind of making it sound like they're one and the same. Again, everybody is up. Ooh, I want to turn off my. So their depiction of military is essentially that they're going to have this uncontrollable urge to aggressively patrol. They're going to deplete their resources rapidly. Basically, they're going to run all their gas out. They're going to use up all their ammunition, and then very quickly they're going to basically fall apart. And I think it's some kind of weird stereotype. I don't know where they come up with this idea, because whoops, hello, could have been a disaster. So so it depends a lot on what the military leadership of this organization was doing in the lead up and what they think needs to happen. So if they're thinking in terms of that they need to restore the National Command Authority, and there's just no way to bring that National Command Authority back, yeah, they may end up doing exactly what the video says, that they're going to just basically run around spinning up all their resources. But now imagine you got someone who was like uh, Amy again. So if you got somebody who's been overseas before in an area where they're like limited supplies, like someone who is the commander of a forward operating base or something like that, they're not going to be the type that just basically blows all their money or blows all their resources away making this stuff or running around. And at some point, if they're good leaders, which the military has, I mean, yeah, they have bad ones too that are going to basically that may exactly follow the template that he lays out. And mind you, when I say he, I'm talking about some AI clanker, but we'll call him he for the sake of he because that's the voice he used. So if you got someone who's used to being in a situation where you're in limited resources, they may adapt very rapidly to it. And if they realize that their situation isn't like there aren't national command authorities coming to help them, then they very well may adapt to the current situation. So imagine if the commander of the military forces in your area was some form of special ops where they're completely used to the idea of being in a situation. Oh, this is able to be harder than I thought it was going to be. So imagine you had a commander who was like someone like the Green Berets, where their whole thing is going out in the middle of a limited supply area and training locals up on how to protect themselves. You're going to get a completely different outcome than what uh, these guys are basically just saying you're going to get. Yeah. So as I was saying, is if you've got somebody who thinks it's their job to, oh, did they break my door down? They sure did. Uh-oh, how bad is this place infested? When I left the other day, the door was still functional. Okay, so another thing that could happen with a military group is it could depend on who they think they're in, who they think's in charge. Do they think it's the military that's in charge, or do they think it's some local civilian authority like a governor or somebody like that that they were reporting to before the disaster occurred? That's going to have a massive impact on how they react, the military reacts to their situation. So if they have reasonable goals, uh, you very well, instead of the military unit being one of the ones that collapses the most quickly, as this video suggests, it could be one of the ones that continues indefinitely. Because if we look at something like Somalia, they're military arms are, I mean, basically the surviving military units are still functional there after 20 years. So it's not like that caused a huge collapse. And even when you talk about something like whoops, the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire, there were a lot of military units that continued functioning, uh, manning their locations well after the, the whole thing was completely done. They just basically eventually would change their missions. How did I do that? Start the card again. Usually it doesn't start that easily. I don't think I can put that in. So I'm going to have to carry it. Yeah. So if you end up having a military commander that's aware of the supply limitations and decides they have a limited mission, like protecting a community or a county or a state, they very well could end up being the longest functioning group out there. And this idea is basically that wannabes and actual military units are the same thing are really kind of goofy. Um, they insinuated that essentially if you showed up at a military group, they just basically put a gun in your hand and send you out patrolling. When the military has a very distinct uh, division of labor itself, so they wouldn't put a gun in everybody's hands, although everyone would be potentially in a position where they were expected to be able to assist the group in defense. Patrolling would go to professionals. And the military is a mix of rank and merit based systems. So if they do have a commander that's falling apart, they're eventually going to try to figure out how to have a system where they have a functional command structure that eventually works. I would expect to see uh, multi county enclaves form around the bases, military bases, or possibly final deployment areas if uh, the military was deployed prior or during whatever disaster was going down. So another thing they talked about was what they called the community group or the neighborhood watch. And the original video depicted this as some kind of like democratic socialist group. And I don't think, essentially with communal food stores and essentially committees and everything like that. And yeah, that probably would happen, but it would start changing rapidly as they had to deal with the circumstances. Um, I would suspect that you would start, because one of the things they said they would be incapable of dealing with changing situation. But that's not typically how human beings form. That's how human beings form when they're safe and they are expecting somebody to come to their rescue. After a certain point, they realize there isn't help coming, and they're going to have to come up with a different way of looking at the world. And I would expect that a lot of them would end up adopting the structure that a lot of American Indian tribes would have used for their governments, which would be they would have some kind of civil authority that might be chief or council based, and then they would have some kind of system for nominating like a war chief in case there was some kind of not gonna do, gotta get gas, but I got plenty, and I got to get this barrel out of here before I get a hurry. Yeah. So although I see this kind of communal committee structure probably starting, but it's going to vary heavily by the group. Because I mean, let's say you have a known politician in your group who's been leading and doing a good job, or cop or a military person who's respected and understood to know what they're doing. They very may easily become a default leader, and the idea of councils and communal decision making would fall by the wayside really quick. I'm have a really hard time understanding where this like commune idea comes from. Now, if you had a commune prior to this, I mean, communes, okay, communes can work with the right group of people, but I would say these, if anyone did a commune type system, it would have had to been set up prior to the disaster or in the very early stages. Communes will basically fall apart very rapidly because uh, of the very things that the clanker talks about in his video, where essentially that without proper decision making happening, you'll start having malingerers not doing their share. You'll have people hoarding and not contributing to the communal stockpiles, and just essentially the whole system will fall apart. And I think I'm going to have to go do that one more time. Not today. Okay. Yeah, and like I said, like anything that actually functions kind of like a commune, if they try forming as the disaster is occurring, uh, yeah, it's pretty much doomed to failure. There's no way they're going to put things together because if you don't know who the people are in your group, they don't work. Uh, Small cities like depending on what resources are available, uh, may work, but big cities, you're essentially going to very rapid collapses. You're going to have if something in the city survives at all, it's basically going to happen. Basically, you have neighborhoods are going to form rather than like a whole city functioning for any particular long. Because the issue is cities are going to rapidly run out of resources, and once the resources run out, uh, they've got nothing to really work off on anymore. Now, one thing that kind of goes back into uh, uh, what I was talking about before is like the idea of a green beret. If somebody comes in like special forces, they could potentially put a bunch of communities together and make them functional, make them so they could actually even defend themselves against marauders, who I'm going to be talking about in the next session here. So, uh, marauders and raiders. Sources might be something like biker gangs, escaped criminals, or other opportunists. You might have like actual gangs inside cities taking these roles. However, these groups aren't going to last particularly long because, with an exception. So, essentially, their soft targets are going to start drying up pretty quickly. Uh, Sources of fuel are going to extraordinarily limit the range. You're going to run out of gas very quickly. Uh, so they're going to, marauders on foot aren't going to do very well, and I very much doubt you're going to get a situation where uh, you have marauders on horseback, because that's a huge leap in learning how to move around on horses. Riding a horse isn't directly easy, especially if you have no experience on it. Now, if they have someone to teach them, it's a possibility, but you got kind of a disconnect there. So once mobility goes away, uh, they're not going to be that big of a deal. They could be a huge impact at the very beginning parts of things, but I think over the long run, you're going to see less and less of them unless they learn to adapt. Now, one thing you got to take in terms of the whole marauder issue is, uh, like a gang like that could potentially basically do what uh, what they might be able to set things up in a way that probably initial governments formed, and we suspect that, because one theory is that everyone decided they wanted a government and they picked somebody and made them leader, and beyond tribal that doesn't work. If you look at it, most likely what you had sedentary farmers being raided by mobile groups, and eventually one mobile group said, hey, we'll protect you if you give us a cut. And this is a possibility where the mobile groups, like the marauders of the gangs, could eventually form the nucleus of a future government. Um, Another thing they talk about is family groups. And I find this one a little bit confusing as well. They're kind of talking about, uh, it doesn't sound like anything we've really had. Um, I would expect, rather than family groups, you would probably, because I mean, actual clans don't really exist anymore, and not in the modern world. So I don't really see how that would come about. I would see more likely a system of extended families forming up on some kind of, maybe land where they have multiple compounds or something along those lines. Uh, the Their idea was that clans wouldn't work well because essentially they would default to a father figure leader, and if if it turned out they weren't making good decisions, then the group would be inflexible and collapse. That's a crazy assumption. What if the father figure? I mean, yeah, some of them are going to be like that, but all you have just as much a likelihood that the father figure is a reasonable decision maker, or maybe even an excellent decision maker. So some of the clans could really survive. But like I said, I don't see actual clans. I see more like multi-family groups, and I see this only happening in rural areas. The biggest issue they're going to face is unprepared neighbors, who probably are going to look at them as a potential source of food, and they're going to have to uh, deal with some of the issues that come up with that, which will be awkward. All right. So we eventually get to the idea of distributed nodes, and this is the one who said this would work like superbly without any issue. Uh, a lot depends on what's going on. What's going on, where you're at, and what resources survived. Um, One of the huge positives is if something bad happens to one group, it doesn't necessarily happen to all the groups. But as they are multiple groups, they don't have good decision making capabilities. So their ability to coordinate might be too slow to react to things that are going on. Collective defense could be a problem depending on how spread out they are. Basically, they could be picked off one by one before they're able to actually figure out how to make everything work. One thing that's a problem is distance increases divisional labor costs and forces you to duplicate, which means this would not be an efficient system. Um, this will work well if outside forces have minimal mobility, uh, or if the nodes are very far from other traveled paths traveled paths. Now, one thing he didn't get into was the idea of tribalism, and I think a lot of people are going to start defaulting to either like states, counties, cities, uh, ethnicities. I think these are going to be big issues. You're also going to have uh, another thing is groups that are pre-catastrophic organizations, church communities, possibly even reenactors, prepper groups, other political groups, where people know each other and have kind of a feel for each other. These groups may be able to form in such a way that uh, and obviously they're going to run into the problems of any other group. If they got good leadership, they'll do well. If they have bad leadership, they'll fall apart. I think like these churches, preppers, political groups will have a lot of the same issues as communal groups, but they'll be able to weed out the free rider issue a lot quicker because they probably know each other better than neighbors do. All right. So in the comments below, what do you think of what my clanker counterpart had to say on these groups versus what I had to say? Are there any groups that you think uh, they're not talking about at all that would come up? Let me know in the comments below. Uh, Please smash the like button if the YouTube algorithms brought you here. I don't do all my videos like this. I just do some of them. It's just a quick way of doing things, and also I'm trying to experiment, which you'll see. And if you know someone who might find this interesting, share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.